Today we'll look at the top 5 chess traps, those sneaky tricks that are both easy to set up and incredibly fun when your opponent falls for them. The simpler and more satisfying the trap, the higher it ranks on this list. Let's jump right in. The first trap, number 5, is the legal trap. It begins with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, a very common setup. White continues with bishop to c4, and black replies with pawn to d6, strengthening the pawn chain. Next, knight to c3, and then black's bishop pins the knight. White pushes pawn to h3, forcing the bishop to decide. The best move here would be to capture, but if black retreats the bishop to h5, white can unleash the legal trap with knight takes e5. At this point, black thinks they can win the queen, but if they capture it, white delivers checkmate. The sequence is bishop takes f7, forcing the king to move. The king cannot go to d7 because the knight controls that square, so it must move to e7. Then comes knight to d5 checkmate, a beautiful and surprising finish that many opponents will not see coming. At number 4 on our list is the Blackburn shilling gambit trap. It also starts with pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to c4. But here, black plays the tricky move knight to d4, setting up a trap. The idea is to tempt white into capturing on e5. If white takes the pawn, black responds with queen to g5, creating threats. Now white has problems. If they panic and push pawn to g3 to defend, the position can collapse very quickly. This knight is going to fall. If white notices that their knight is under attack, they might try moving it down to f7, thinking it's safe because the bishop is protecting it. Unfortunately, it is not safe at all. The black queen can now move to g2, attacking the rook in the corner. If white tries to hold on to that rook by moving the rook to f1, black responds with queen to e4 check. There is no real way for white to stop this. If white sacrifices their queen, black will simply capture it and continue attacking. If white tries to block with the bishop, then comes the sneaky checkmate, knight to f3. The bishop cannot capture because it is pinned to the queen, and suddenly it's checkmate. Now let's look at another possibility. Suppose white does not move the rook to f1. Instead, they get greedy and capture more material, overlooking black's threat. In that case, black plays queen takes on h1. White has no choice but to respond with bishop to f1, but then comes queen to e4 check. Once again, the white queen is lost on e2. If white tries to defend with bishop to e2, then bishop to c5 follows, and this leads directly to checkmate. To give you the quick version, if you haven't seen this position before, it can continue with knight to c3, followed by knight to f3 check. It is not immediate mate because the white king can slide over to f1, but then comes queen to h4, threatening queen to f2 checkmate. White has no way to escape this deadly attack. White is really forced into a bad position here, and even though they might try to hang on, checkmate or heavy material loss is right around the corner. Coming in at number 3 on our list is the elephant trap, one of the most well-known tricks from the Queen's Gambit declined. It begins with pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, where white offers up the queen's pawn gambit. Black declines with pawn to e6, white continues developing with knight to c3, and black answers with knight to f6. Then comes bishop to g5, pinning the knight to the queen. At this point, black calmly plays knight to d7, reinforcing the knight and keeping everything solid. Now here's where the trap takes shape. White often captures the pawn on d5, believing they can win material. Black recaptures with the e6 pawn, and now it looks like white can take the central pawn on d5 again. White's reasoning is simple. The knight on f6 can't capture back because it's pinned to the queen by the bishop on g5. This is exactly the false sense of security black wants to create. If white greedily takes the pawn, black suddenly flips the script by capturing white's knight on d5. Now the queen is exposed, but it doesn't matter, because the pin doesn't actually hold. If white tries to press on and capture black's queen with bishop takes d8, black responds with bishop to b4 check. The only legal move white has is queen to d2, but then black's bishop captures on d2, and after white recaptures with the king, black simply takes on d8 with the king. The result? Black ends up with a huge lead in material. White thought they were winning the queen, but instead they walked right into a devastating counter, losing both pieces and momentum. That's why this trap is so effective. It punishes greed in a very clean and tactical way. Coming in at number 2 is the Lasker trap. Another sharp idea, this time from the Albin counter gambit. It starts with pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4. And instead of the usual solid continuation, black immediately counters with pawn to a5, launching into the Albin line. If you do not play the Albin counter gambit often, you might want to reconsider because it is one of the most dangerous counterattacks to the queen's gambit. Now black pushes forward with pawn to d4, supported by the queen. The pawn on e5 can always be taken later, so black is not worried. At this stage, white often plays pawn to e3, thinking that if black captures, white can simply exchange queens and enjoy a solid position with good central control. But this is where the trap begins. Instead of capturing, black plays bishop to b4 check. The natural reply from white is bishop to d2, blocking the check. Now comes the sneaky continuation. Pawn takes e3. White might believe they can safely capture the bishop on b4, thinking black has made a mistake. But if white does so, black responds with queen takes d1 check. After the white king recaptures, it does not matter whether it takes with the king or the pawn. White ends up in a terrible position, down material. The real danger, however, comes if white captures incorrectly. Suppose white plays bishop takes b4, then black launches pawn to f2 check. White is forced to move the king to e2. Now comes the critical move. Pawn takes on g1, promoting into a knight with check. Suddenly, white faces two terrible choices. If the king moves away from the queen, the white queen will be captured. If the king retreats back to e1, then queen to h4 check follows. After king to d2, white's king is awkwardly exposed, and then black develops with knight to c6, bringing more pieces into the attack. Even though this does not always lead to immediate checkmate, white's position collapses quickly. On top of that, it is not every day in chess that you can say you have 3 knights on the board at once. That alone makes this trap a rare and satisfying accomplishment. So, if nothing else, the Lasker trap earns its place on our list at number 3 for its creativity, tactical sharpness, and the sheer fun of chasing your opponent's king around while holding 3 knights. Coming in at number 1 is the England gambit trap, which starts with pawn to d4, pawn to e5. Yes, it is a real opening, and if you have not tried it yet, you definitely should. White usually captures with pawn takes e5, then black develops knight to c6, putting pressure on the pawn. White often tries to hold on by defending, and that is when black sets the stage for a devastating trap. If white tries to hold on to the extra pawn by playing bishop to f4, black immediately strikes with queen to b4 check, which also attacks the bishop on f4 at the same time. White usually responds by retreating the bishop, attacking the queen in the process. But then black's queen captures the pawn on b2, and the trap is set. The common mistake from white at this point is playing bishop to c3, thinking it is a strong move because it attacks the queen. The rook on a1 appears safe since it is defended by the knight on b1, but in reality, this move fails badly. Black replies with bishop to b4, and suddenly white has no good options. If white tries to block with the queen, black can simply capture with the bishop. If the queens are exchanged, black's queen will slide back into the attack, leading to a quick checkmate. If instead white captures with the knight, black can calmly take the rook on a1 and still maintain the pressure. Even other defensive tries do not work. For example, if white plays knight to c3, black's queen simply takes the knight, leaving white's position in ruins. If white instead plays knight to a3, hoping to use the queen for defense, that also collapses quickly, as the defenses cannot hold. So, while at first glance it may look like white is gaining an active position in the center with bishop to c3, in reality it is exactly the trap black is hoping for. The beauty of the England gambit trap is that it is both easy for opponents to stumble into and very simple for black to execute. A quick loss of material, or even a checkmate, often follows, making this one of the most dangerous ambushes in chess.